good afternoon. This is the opening of the afternoon, and this time I'm going to translate myself, which is as well quite work, because after all we are all interfaces. We either manage to make the content accessible or not. So I will give a very, very short presentation of a project which is called Polytopia, that lives on the web for the last 2 years. It is hosted in the website of Space Collective, which can be found easily. It's www.spacecollective.com. And it was created by a director and very special graphic designer, Koene and Volker. But I think what is most relevant here is the kind of philosophical experiment that Polytopia represents, and the way it was born and what for, under which kind of intent. First of all, the word Polytopia comes from poly, which means many, and topos, which in Greek means place or state, as in state of affair or state of mind. And it stands for the kind of plurality and diversity that we are moving towards in a very fast way, speedy way, if we look at all the very interesting topics that we had these last 3 days. It looks it's quite a characteristic of our future. There was a metaphor that was used in the presentation of Max Moore concerning the fact that the future is not Star Trek-like. And I think it's a very important one, and it's a very important one also from the emotional standpoint, because when we look at science fiction movies, what we find there is that, yes, the human is always the same, and also the emotional fabric stays exactly the same. So the motivations are the same, and the communication patterns are the same. And knowing that we are going towards more and more plurality, it makes sense to begin to consider the necessity of creating the conceptual backbone that might help us accommodate the plurality and the diversity that characterize our future, our close future, not that far. And it is something that it's not very well performed at the moment. So I will begin with the very, it's meant to be very fast, and I'm going to introduce some of the key concepts. Polytopia is existing as a group of thinkers and artists and writers on the net that are basically engaging with what I've been describing till here. So the possibility of a conceptual backbone for the future. And it comes as, in this sense, as a ground for engagement with the future. And so I'm going here just to present some of the main concepts and the way we correlated them in the map that are coming up in all the polylogs that are ongoing within this philosophical experiment in the last 2 years. So here we can see it's Polytopia. We began by calling it our mind habitat in the infoverse, because we are more and more immersed within this networked reality and this data reality. And in a way, we need a mind habitat. It cannot be considered a home in the physical aspect of it, but we need a habitat where to exist within the infocology that hosts us. And there is a great opportunity with it because it's open for design, it's open for input, it's open for engagement in this case. So the first key concept that I would mention is what I call a ground for engagement, which means that Polytopia proposes itself as a ground for engagement with the future, a ground for engagement with the other. And in this sense, it is a facilitator of a transcultural meeting of minds. And no, and as I said before, it's also an attitude towards the future. And this is, you can see what is written here is future as a plurality of open-ended narratives, which one of the main difficulties that we have at the moment is how to interface this kind of possible reality. We do not know how to communicate with it, or we do not know how to have it happen. So in a way, part of this philosophical experiment is also the creation of a relevant interface. It doesn't matter if it is conceptual, if it is in the immediacy of tools and media, but it's a very big part of the dealing with it. So, from the plurality of open-ended narrative, we have the manifesting of multiple inclinations, and what I said before concerning interface and aesthetic interface. This I will get what I said initially concerning the metaphor about emotions and fabric of emotions, because without managing to engage the emotional aspect of whoever comes to respect the future or the plurality of ideas that are there, basically not necessarily there is the possibility to interact with it and to translate it into a live dialogue or a live debate or an open door that is participating and not resisting in this sense. Whenever you have an interface which is functional and is aesthetic in this sense, it stands also, there is another pointer with aesthetic which is called the aesthetic singularity, in the sense that whenever we think of why to engage with the future and where to project it towards, the first answer is one that comes from emotions, from art, from aesthetics, from beauty. Or at least this is the way we wish to describe it or to see it or to project it. So whenever this is increasing in its iteration, we manage to eliminate barriers in between mediums and in between dimensions. This is something that we behold very clearly in the whole event of the web. We see that already barriers that have to do with the distance in space and distance in time, and barriers that have to do with the specific parameters of identity, like gender, like nationality, like origin, are very much diffused, opening quite freedom in this sense to a different kind of interaction that was never possible before. And it has very interesting implications that we are also exploring, but also describing, entering the effort of the description of it. So one of the key points, as I said before, is diversity, diversity which is intended as diversity within an ecosystem. The different forms of life of an ecosystem can describe its diversity. One of the important aspects here is that when we refer to sentient entities and we project it to a future, we are not speaking about necessarily human entities. Another very important aspect of it is that if we wish to accommodate this diversity without too much suffering, we will have to bypass the biological interfaces that mostly belong to a previous evolutionary era. They mostly belong to what we call the Neolithic mind, and in a way we already behold that with the few tools that we have, being it the technology or the increased level of interconnectivity, the possibilities for communication are branching and bifurcating, and they bring quite a set of variety and possibilities that we are not usually experiencing face-to-face, though the face-to-face might bring eventually a very critical aspect of it, but I think there is something that opens in terms of future to see what does it mean to interact and to cooperate and to engage without the first set of parameters and barriers. The second one is accessibility. Now this is a very important one. This is also why we made a part of this presentation, because no matter which is the cluster of ideas, if it is transhumanism, as we heard all these days, if it is ideas about opportunity and possibilities about the future, we have the issue of making them accessible. And what does it mean to make them accessible? And one of the things that belongs to this age is that the ways and modes of creating accessibility are in explosion. We never had so many. So the creation of interfaces becomes a very critical parameter, no matter in which kind of context. It's not only from the standpoint of the digital context. So as I said before, it dissolves time and space, for example, through communication, which by now it's telepresence, and a distributed value system. Because if we wish for sentient interaction, we cannot ground the gravity around a closed or a fixed value system. It will never manage to include or to accommodate neither the diversity nor the possibility nor what we heard before, the diversion from the anthropocentric view. Another thing that, another parameter which is very critical is how to create a kind of event. It doesn't matter if it is a social event, a conceptual event, a mini event, that has more than one entry and exit point. For those of you who are familiar with the concept of raison, this is basically what it speaks about. It's the ability to create a network of some kind that does not have a tree-like structure, but has multiple entry points and multiple exit points, because we see it very clearly, for example, within Polytopia and the kind of polylogue that is going on there, that each one has his cue, each one has from where, which kind of interest, which kind of motivation, which kind of time it will be relevant to enter, to take part, and to exit. So this is just an example of this, but it's about creating a change, a significant change in the architecture. The architecture to which we are used, it's mostly tree-like. It doesn't matter if it is an organization, if it is knowledge, if it is the way we describe the world. We always find some kind of hierarchical way to open structures. And this is a kind of architecture that tries to bypass that, because it's an architecture that adapts much better to a diversified kind of face space. Next. Openness. There is the concept of open as it is known from the web, but there is also the concept of open in terms of how much possibility there is for engagement with something and how much freedom to take whatever is available, made accessible, and to develop it in a particular kind of direction. Now, I heard this as an underline in many of the talks of transhumanist direction, speaking about the possibility of basically developing one's body, one's life, one's opportunity in the direction that looks most intimate to the individual. So in this sense, it's an openness to bifurcation, because the moment something is being really made accessible and open, it begins to bifurcate. It is an opening in knowledge and perspective, because there must be a flow in order for it to be alive and iterative. And it's an emergent, basically where it leads to, it's to an emergent collaborative marketplace. It doesn't matter if it's of ideas, of technologies, of cross-fertilization, which brings us to, yes. Multiplicity here stands basically for the possibility that becomes very tangible in our future to run multiple flows, to run multiple identities, to run multidimensionality. So the fact that we are in contact within the same time, even if we are not close space-wise, it is something that, for example, grows with the increase of connectivity. It doesn't matter how it grew along all the history of our civilization, we are coming to quite a threshold within it. I will not enter the whole of it, but basically this is what it is, an option that opens and that we are basically looking up to, what I call combined interactive intelligence, which is basically how to create the kind of ambient environment and state, multiple states, in which this is facilitated. Why? because it brings an extra in value, and it brings an extra in resources, and it brings an extra in interest. We do need cross-fertilization. We do need many, many things in the correlation and communication with each other. We are going, and we heard it many times already, we are going in an almost impossible future ahead, whether for the good or for the bad, and if we will not be able to enter it, think it, project it, and actuate it together, or simply survive it together, I don't think we really have the resources to do it.
Yeah, that's the last.
Okay.
You want to go in?
Okay.
Oh.
So the last one basically brings to this fluid affinity replaces nucleic identity. I will be very, very short about it, which means that as long as we are based upon a kind of identification that has specific parameters, it doesn't matter if they are the outcome of the place where we live or the way we are raised or many other kind of narratives, we are doomed to work because my identity negates any different kind of identity, as good as we can be in pretending it doesn't. Fluid affinity stands for the possibility that through all what I described above, an irrelevant kind of interface and an enough degree of plurality, we might be able to interact through fluid affinity. Means the moment there is an affinity between me and you, we are going to interact. This does not define us and it does not identify us, but it gives us the motivation and the possibility to interact and to do something out of it. So that's basically it. And I wish to
Thank Julia.
Yes, to thank Julia for this presentation.
I think this was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure there are questions. We're going to take one or two questions. I'm going to ask the first one. Now, this looks like a very interesting project, and switch to what I'm on, because I want to give the floor to someone who is much more interested than I to listen to, who is Sandberg, whom everyone knows. But you're using the PDF or the PPT? Right, so you choose which one to use. I'm giving the floor to Sandberg for the second talk of the afternoon.
Thank you. And of course, there is this law of nature that whenever somebody starts talking, people start to arrive. So if I just do a bit of meaningless talk now, the internet connection might organize itself nicely. Right. Let's see what happens. Well, usually. It's very enjoyable to be here on TransVision. I actually managed to be so far on all transmissions except for the one in Caracas. It kind of annoys me that I missed that one. I cannot go back in time and fix that. But generally, I've been talking about a lot of very different subjects on TransVision, a ridiculous amount about cognitive enhancement. And after a while, that gets boring. So I started to look for other subjects. So now I'm going to do big picture stuff. We at the Future Humanity Institute, we kind of take pride in trying to think about the big issues. And now I'm trying to take it as far as it's literally physically possible to go. That doesn't mean I'm uninterested in the more concrete areas. I actually think it's very important to tie what we're doing and thinking about into the real life, into the everyday politics, what to actually tell politicians and convince the civil servants about. How this would tie in, though, I don't know. We have to think about it. We have to be very creative and open for any social network. So basically, my question is, what can we say about the possibilities for really, really advanced civilizations in the universe? And it turns out that there are a few ways we can actually analyze this. And this is interesting because we're also learning about the universe right now. We're starting to see some aspects which are somewhat disconcerting if you're a transhumanist like me. Because the universe seems to have some bad sides that we will have to deal with. And similarly, the laws of physics also have some aspects which limit what we can do with really advanced civilizations. So my talk is going to be kind of sketching out some estimates of what could we achieve given what we currently know about physics and even what we can extrapolate in. And finally, hopefully, what we can actually say about what we should be doing in the present. Because perhaps surprisingly, from these rather cosmic speculations, there are a few concrete things we can actually start thinking about. Well, I always wanted to start a paper with this sentence, consider a spherical super civilization. And the paper version of this will definitely contain it. And in general, of course, what can we say about these ultimate things? In theology, there is a discipline called eschatology, the teachings about the final things, the end of the world, where the soul is going, all the really big and dramatic stuff. Freeman Dyson, however, the great physicist, he started a thing called physical eschatology in 1979 with his brilliant paper about whether life could survive indefinitely in open universes. And since then, this little domain has thrived and grown. It's not an enormous area. It's much more speculative and strange than even the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But there are a few results. I've been working together with Nina Sirkovic from Belgrade, who's also an associate with us. So some of these results are due to discussions with him, and I hope to co-author this paper with him. He's done a marvelous review about the whole literature of physical eschatology. And another interesting thing about this is that act badly, it don't. Or it could be that life itself is good, or freedom, or indeed love. However, we can't say really what we or an alien civilization might eventually figure out about these things. It might turn out that no civilization will ever figure out what the ultimate goal is. However, we can figure out instrumental goals, goals that are actually quite good for achieving most of this work. If we have more intelligence in general, if we have more technological capability, if we have more resources, better security and better ability to coordinate, we can actually achieve most of these goals easier. So that seems to be something that no matter what kind of civilization you have, you will tend to benefit from. You can, of course, imagine kind of pathological civilizations that just want to exist for exactly 1,000 years and then leave a nice black hole behind. That's certainly a possible view. There is much stranger views among humans. But it seems rather unlikely that such a civilization would last. So in the long run, it seems that computational power, physical access, and communication are going to be something that surviving big civilizations are going to be interested in, even though these ones are just stepping stones to something much more important in life. Another interesting thing is, whatever the ultimate goals are, that might also determine what the civilization wants to do on the larger scales. So, for example, if pure pleasure is the most important goal, it might not matter that we can't communicate with each other. If we have little stations containing extremely happy brains, it doesn't matter if these stations never encounter each other, because these happy brains are just producing a lot of happiness. That might seem rather strange, because most of our concept of happiness is, of course, more of social nature. So we might imagine, on the other hand, that it's something cultural that is really important in life. Or it might even be that we want to maximize the total amount of intelligence. And that seems to require bigger areas, bigger systems that are connected. Thoughts must be able to cross from one side to the other. Cultural trait must be able to cross over. So this goes to some extent actually do determine where the civilization might want to be going. Okay, and we're going to get some extra information here.
No, I'd like to ask you to take a 30 seconds break to copy the presentation for me on the USB disk, because the people on the internet would like to see the presentation itself.
Oh, okay. That would be lovely. So where does the stick hide?
Is there? The little stick is there.
Untitled?
Yeah, your presentation is here, better, no better to do.
Yep, well, we get to both.
Okay.
2 for the price of 1. All right.
Okay, this is a special message from me to Sergio Carrero. As you see, your wish is our command. We have interrupted Anders for 30 seconds in order to copy his PPT on the stick. Now I'm going on the other computer.
How do I disconnect this?
Just go.
Okay, yeah, great.
Okay, just
yeah, no problem. That's fine. Yep. Well, sorry. Let's see what we can get here. So, we get a brief review of everything again. Yep. So, what about the universe? So now we've been thinking about what civilizations might want. What about the universe? And I have some bad news. The universe seems to be a rather unsustainable thing. From an environmentalist point of view, the universe seems to be very, very bad. Normally, when we're talking about environmental things, it's of course the activities of human civilizations which are the problem. But what do you do when nature itself seems to be bent on making things work? Right now, we're living in what's called the stelliferous era. If we look outside our galaxy, we see, of course, first of all, we see the galaxy because there are so many stars. 100 billion stars just in the Milky Way dominating the sky. But if you look beyond that, you get interest in large-scale structures. We see that we have enormous clouds of galaxies forming this beautiful, intricate structure. This is a fairly old map, but you see these voids and these streams of clusters of galaxies. It's quite beautiful. Unfortunately, it won't last. And most of us, of course, know that stars tend to burn out. The good news is that small mass stars are actually quite tenacious. In 1 trillion years, we're still going to be red dwarf stars shining. It's not kind of going to be the sun color scale of the universe, but we're still going to be around. But still, it is annoying that stars are running out. Certainly stars are exploding and creating shock waves in the gas, other star formation, and so on, but eventually it's going to slow down. It's going to not slow down tomorrow, but in about 1 trillion years. We also got a lot of dark matter. This is the bullet cluster, where it's kind of evidence. They have used some computer coloring here for the motions, but there is a lot of dark matter around. Dark matter in itself is not that bad. There is a lot of it too. We're just about 100 of the real universe. Unfortunately, dark matter doesn't so far seem to have much of a structure. It doesn't look like it can build very much interesting stuff out of it. It doesn't look like right now that it can be used for mind. And that's a bit sad. We can probably do something other useful with it though. So if we look at the kind of history, and this of course I cribbed immediately from the font of all knowledge, Wikipedia. So this is a diagram of the history of the universe using a double logarithmic scale. So we're down there in the Stelliferous era. This brief young period, a transient at the start of the universe, where there are stars. And most galaxies haven't collided with each other to turn into big elliptical galaxies. And of course, in the long run, it's mainly going to be white dwarf stars and neutron stars hanging around. And then eventually those are going to cool down, so the white dwarfs are going to become perfect diamond crystals, quite beautiful, except that it's not going to be pretty dark around them. Except that in the really long run, of course, protons, according to most theories of supersymmetry, seem to have to be unstable. So we have never ever observed a proton decay, but it seems to be a very strong theoretical reason to believe protons are not unstable, which means that eventually matter is going to evaporate. It's going to take a ridiculous amount of time, by hours, but it's going to happen. And then the only thing that's going to be left is going to be a bunch of positrons, electrons, and black holes. And the black holes, again, according to, we haven't observed it, but it seems pretty likely, they are going to evaporate due to Hawking radiation. It's going to take about a Google years, but eventually all the black holes are going to evaporate, and then we just let few lonely electrons floating around in nothingness, and nothing in particular happening. Which is not exactly true, actually, which I'm going, if I get the time, I can get into that. Then, of course, there is another problem with the universe. This is a bug or a feature, depending on how you see it. It has a cosmological horizon. That means that it's accelerating. It's not just expanding, it's expanding faster and faster. This means that if you want to go to a remote galaxy, it seems to be receding. While you're on your way towards that, it seems to be speeding up relative to your spaceship. Which means that beyond a certain distance, about 15 billion light years, you will not be able to catch it up even with a light speed spaceship. This is pretty annoying. That means that we cannot get beyond that. We can see some of those galaxies, and we know we will never, ever get there. And it's about 1/3 to the edge of the visible universe, so we can actually observe quite a lot of things we can never touch. It also has another bad effect. What's going to happen is, of course, the galaxies are going to move apart. Galaxies that are orbiting each other in a cluster are safe. They're going to continue orbiting. But the clusters are going to tend to drift apart. If you have a supercluster with a lot of little clusters orbiting each other, it can hold together. But the superclusters, that beautiful lacy structure, is kind of going to be fragmenting. And you get these little island universes separated by accelerating distances. So eventually you're just going to see your own supercluster. Personally, I find that's sad, but it's not really dangerous. The real danger is that it's also making the universe dangerously hot. 10 to the minus 29 Kelvin. Due to various rather weird aspects, this is of course partially not measured, so this needs to have some quantum gravity to take that into account. So you need to believe in Hawking radiation and so on. It seems that you get horizon radiation. That means that the temperature never goes down to zero. And that's bad news for you who happen to like Freeman-Dyson's model, because as we're going to see, you need really cold temperatures to do a lot of processing. And if it never gets down to zero, that means we have a limit on how much processing we can do. So all in all, we have a problem, but we are right down here, and real soon, if we spread out rapidly, we can actually reach the horizon. But not long after that, we're actually going to have this fragmentation of everything into this disconnected little component. And if we wait long enough, well, all molecular structures get gone, and then of course there is no structure at all, because assuming you can build something out of black holes, they're going to be gone. And then in the far future, you might even get Boltzmann brains, which tend to infest old universes. I don't think I'm going to have the time to get into them, but they're more a problem for the philosophy department than the physics department. But in any way, let's see, what can we do about growth? How much can any civilization grow? And there are various things that limit what we can do. The amount of resources we got, the light speed limit, and the thermodynamics of computation. Thermodynamics is an interesting area because I might imagine that some future we find a way of traveling faster than light. I would be slightly surprised, but I wouldn't really be outraged and say, no, that must just be wrong. However, I would probably say that if somebody found a way around the second law of thermodynamics, because that seemed to be really fundamental and really tied to the way things are, because restated it means we tend to get to more probable states more with a higher probability than less probable ones, which almost seems to be a tautology. And that's a bit hard to get around. And finally, we have a problem of wasting. So the amount of resources we can get, this is nice view. We can get quite a lot of kilograms of stuff here. And if you count dark matter, it might be useful for something, you will get even more. And even in a supercluster, you can get a lot. I also done some calculation. If you actually start moving galaxies together to make a hypercluster, you get about an order of magnitude extra, but I think the hassle is going to be pretty horrendous. You literally need to use galaxy masses and turn them into energy to move enormous amounts of clouds of dark matter. I don't want to be air traffic control or that. The nice thing about matter is we know we can build this stuff out. It's very convenient. And we can actually make memory storage, we can do processing. Dark matter, it might be possible to extract energy from it, especially by dumping it into black holes and then extracting energy from black holes. Black holes also seem to have a nice property that we can use to cool things. And maybe, according to Seth Lloyd, they might be used for processing. That's very wild hand-waving for the moment, so we shouldn't trust that. We can't really expand faster than light, it seems. And in reality, of course, our spaceships are limited by the horrible Tsiolkovsky rocket equation that forces us to use a ridiculous amount of energy to get anywhere fast. The good news is, however, that even that stressful diagram I showed previously it gives us plenty of time. Even if we move at a lousy 1% of light speed, it's still pretty doable to get out to the far reaches. Especially if you use self-replicating probes, which seems to be a pretty likely technology in the not too far future. It's also interesting to note that it's actually better to send packets of matter rather than laser beams or radio signals. They're more efficient energy-wise. So maybe the postal service does have a future. I tried to keep the equations away, but here's my favorite one, the Brillouin inequality. That actually shows that there is a certain cost of energy you always have to pay in order to erase information. And there's no concept, but we can never be it. We can also try to trick things by using so-called reversible computing. We then need to translate things into bigger, long-lasting, and larger computations. But that doesn't really change my argument very much. We need to pay a certain cost of this entropy to format the world, to actually build whatever it is our civilization is based on. So basically, that's of course what it is. It's going to be doing other things. But the computational substrate, that's of course going to be underlying. For example, you might argue that happiness might not be a computational process, but it seems like you would have to distinguish moment from moment, and that requires memory. And you probably want to have a quality to the happiness, and that also seems to contain information. The real cost here seems to be also that we need error correction. Bits are occasionally going to go wrong, and then we need to fix it. And that has a cost that you cannot get away from. We need to get rid of this wastage from all this error fixing. And again, we can use the background radiation, or we can use big black holes. I really think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to get into this, but there's a lot of weird engineering you can start thinking about here. So, putting it all together and kind of leaving out a lot of details, this kind of scenario I ended up with together with Milan is we have kind of 3 ages of the universe. We're leaving out that all started, that kind of once upon a time, and that was all of human and post-human history, and probably most of our expansion into this galaxy. And then you get to the age of expansion, which would be spreading out across the universe. And that can be done probably with self-replicating probes. And it seems that it's not too hard, given even current understanding species, to get there. The interesting thing is once you put your little flag on something, it seems that if you have a self-replicating technology, it's pretty easy to hold it. This is due to a particular theory about the Lanchester equation I don't have to get into, but basically it seems that first come, first serve. It's mine. So that means that there are several groups. It's pretty likely that they could grab stuff from each other without extremely wasteful conflicts. So having something means that you can probably keep it for a long time. And it seems to be rational actually to wait. Rather than immediately taking that juicy galaxy and turning all that energy inside it into computations or happiness, it makes sense to wait. Because if the universe is twice as cold, you can do twice as many computations. And if nobody can actually take your galaxy from you in a practical sense, then it actually is really useful to wait a long while and that galaxy just gets more and more valuable up until eventually the universe stops getting colder. And it turns out that you don't really need to turn all the galaxy into guardian robots or things like that for doing the waiting. There is a cool thing about that you need just a few copies, actually, or backup copies, to have a good chance of indefinite survival. The problem might be that your neighbors might actually start into chewing up their galaxy and heating up the local universe. So then you get really annoyed. Either you also start heating up stuff, or you have to wait really much longer before things cool down after very little delay. It actually turns out that this really surprised me. There doesn't seem to be a good reason to turn off the stars. Previously, I was kind of feeling fastidious. Okay, let's turn off the stars and wait and use that. But it turns out that all that fusion, all these supernovas, they're about 1% of the total amount of mass. And you can get much more back through burning a black hole. So it seems to be relatively rational, unless it's really easy to turn off stars, to actually just leave them there. They look good. But maybe if you're feeling extremely green, you want to turn off the stars anyway, just in case. Entropy is back. And finally, as a very far future, we end up with actually exploiting this energy. And it turns out that the slower you are exploiting this, the better it is. The more computation you get out of it, because if you use all your energy immediately, you heat up, and then it becomes costly to fix. So ideally, you should erase one bit there, then you wait a few millennia or trillions of years or whatever, and then you erase another bit. And you do very, very slowly. However, you can't do it too slowly because, of course, matter and structure tend to decay. So there's a kind of upper time limit. So in my calculations, I found that, well, if you actually wait until this very late era rather than just doing it, you get at least 30 orders of magnitude more computation, which is useful for whatever is important than if you just do it right now. And you can also, but you also have this time limit, so you might need to still do it a bit faster than you would like to. There are interesting possibilities about maybe baby universes are way out, etc. I don't have the time to get into them, but right now things look dark, but we're going to have plenty of time to figure out ways of getting out of that. There is also an interesting idea that, well, maybe after the last competition has been done, all the universes used up, whatever has to be done, we should actually literally try to turn off the universe. There's something called the big rip that literally rips apart the universe, and that's good to keep the Boltzmann rate. So, what does this lead in terms of policy and in keeping the timetable? Well, first of all, we have, well, it's important with the timetable. After all, every moment we wait, we're losing galaxies. And this galaxy could be home to so many happy beings, so much knowledge, so much interesting stuff. So I kind of updated this calculation, but basically, waiting in colonizing space loses an amazing number of possible human lives, or post-human lives. Similarly, as Nick has pointed out, any increase in the risk of us going extinct before getting to this glorious future also corresponds to a ridiculous amount of possible loss. And that suggests that we should actually take not just space colonization much more seriously and really go for it, but also existential threat are much worse than most people think. The problem is when we discount that, we tend to ignore it. Finally, and I think this is an interesting thing, we also have a wonderful chance by being stuck here together on a planet. We actually have to speak to each other, and we can speak to each other. Once we start spreading out, we're going to lose actually causal contact. And that's going to be needed for really late eras. So we need to figure out game rules now before we actually, let's say, leave the solar system. So we still probably got plenty of time, but it's actually quite important to make use of our limitations right now, because our limitations right now allow us to come up with rational choices that are going to make the future as good as possible. Well, that was that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anders, since I guess everyone has Anders' email, we also have one question.
Well, first, I see a lot of good startup ideas in that presentation.
Yeah.
What about multiverses? Is there any way to plan for a way to access that kind of shadow photon from various?
So far, I have not seen any useful way of making use of multiverses, except of course quantum computing and stuff like that. So most likely multiverses are not going to be helpful in that form. There is something you can do some forms of a case of. You can do a kind of trade with multiverses by using simulations, but I think maybe this is mostly kind of philosophical, happy thought experiments rather than any practical startup idea. But the idea is that you can threaten other universes by threatening them. If you don't do as I say, I will run a million simulations of your universe and my universe, and then it's going to be a very nasty simulation. But the problem is you can't communicate that. So this mainly works if you're a philosopher. It doesn't work really as a business idea.
Okay, we're going to have one other short question while I change the order. One more and that's the last one.
Yeah.
Can you say something more about computation?
About
Irreversible computation.
yes. So the problem with normal computation is that it tends to be irreversible. The inputs to a little logic gate, you cannot figure them out from the output. That means that there is a thermodynamic law. Entropy has increased. However, if you have a computation that can be run backwards, then it doesn't increase entropy. So this works wonderfully well on paper, of course, and you can actually, in principle, build the physical systems for it. And there are actually good reasons to try to do it in order to keep the heat emissions down. And there is a theorem by Bennett showing that irreversible computations can be turned into reversible ones at a slight cost. And the slight cost whenever a computer scientist says that, of course, you should run away, because that can be very big. This one, I think, is just polynomial, so it's not too terrible. But it's not trivial to do it. But in a very cold, dark universe, I think that would be a perfect place to do a lot of reversible computation. So what I've found is lower bounds. We're going to be possible to do quite a lot of much more, but it's...
Thank you very much, Anders.
Thank you very much.
So in introducing the next speaker, we're going to talk about the law in the kind of the singularity. That Martin is not here this afternoon because she has been very interested in the talk. I want to mention a couple of things first. These are two Italian scientists. They are affiliated with iLabs, which is an Italian transhumanist organization, which in turn is affiliated with the network of Italian transhumanists. And you have heard our comments yesterday about this little tension between two organizations. With this talk, we have had 3 speakers from one organization, 3 from the other organization, which maybe gives some substance to what Giuseppe Latino was saying yesterday, that perhaps this event marks the beginning of more collaboration between the Italian Transhumanist Association and the network of Italian transhumanists. And I'd like to add my voice to this hope raised by Giuseppe. You will have noticed that another member of a team, Stefano Vai, who was with us yesterday and the day before, is not with us today. As you know, he's not with us today because he's still recovering from the major surgery he had last week, and it's best to be with us on the first day of the conference, even if he was not in very good health. So I'd like to invite everyone to applaud Stefano. Thank you very much. And with this, I'd like to give the floor to Marta, Rossi, and Jacopo Tagliabue. The talk will be half in Italian and half in English. It's mainly in Italian, but they're going to summarize the main points in English.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti, come faremo più o meno metà presentazione in italiano e metà in inglese. Diciamo che alla fine della diapositiva la mia mente stesa ripeterà in inglese, cercherà di riassumere brevemente i punti fondamentali. Siamo Marta, Rossi e Tagliabue di Labs e l'obiettivo di oggi è quello di affrontare un argomento che, almeno in questi termini, in termini di cui andremo a parlarne oggi, è stato molto poco trattato anche dagli addetti ai lavori. L'argomento è appunto la legge ai tempi della singolarità e brevemente si tratta di indagare i rapporti tra la singolarità tecnologica e l'amministrazione della giustizia.
I am going to translate each slide, so just for the English-speaking world. And basically, what we're seeing now is Marta Rossi and Jacopo Tagliabue. We are from IREX, that's a laboratory based in Milan and founded in 1977. And the point we're trying to make today is that there's a strong connection between we approaching the singularity and how the law and the administration of justice would be in this kind of work. So we're going to explore some opportunities and to make explicit some challenges we're going to face in this process.
Davanti a questo pubblico occorre spendere fortunatamente solo poche parole per introdurre la parte, diciamo, generale dell'argomento. Fondamentalmente, se Raymond Rossi e ormai molti ricercatori e scienziati hanno ragione, ci troveremo ad avere circa nel 2060, magari Jacopo spiegherà meglio il grafico, non c'è bisogno di spiegarlo troppo, un momento di singolarità in cui esperiremo un cambiamento devastante a livello sia individuale che a livello di società in cui andiamo a vivere. E in base a questo è bene, dal nostro punto di vista, provare a fare delle previsioni.
So, as you've seen, the graph is very famous graph. It's made popular by Raymond Kurzweil's work. So, the main point is that if the accelerating trend in technology will continue, we are going to experience a singularity at around 2060 or something like that. But the main point is that since this will be such as an unparalleled moment of change, as unprecedented improvement in our life, it's going to be very important to start thinking today about what is going to be our life as individual as part of our society in that period. So we think it's very important to think this kind of relationship between individual and society starting from now.
Sì, come ovvio che sia, la maggior parte dei ricercatori e degli scienziati che si sono occupati di fare delle previsioni più o meno accurate nelle varie aree di ricerca si sono occupati giustamente più degli aspetti prettamente scientifici e tecnologici di quello che succederà con l'avvento della singolarità. Dalla fisica, quindi all'avvicinarsi sempre maggiore di un livello più accurato di descrizione della realtà che ci circonda, alla medicina, nanotecnologie, sistema nuovo di trapianti, staminali e via così, intelligenza artificiale sia applicata che teorica, le nuove ricerche del mind uploading o le nuovissime ricerche di intelligenza artificiale teorica sul coscienziometro, quindi sul modello per misurare i vari livelli di coscienza. Dal nostro punto di vista sono stati un po' trascurati fondamentalmente due aspetti, tre, che dal nostro punto di vista sono abbastanza essenziali. Dal punto di vista prettamente filosofico, ad esempio, per quanto riguarda le tesi della filosofia della mente, che molti
artificial intelligence tools and expert system to see what's really going on in a situation. So if you don't know what happened yesterday, we can have very good detective that can have computational powers and a lot of knowledge to let us know what really happened in a crime scene or something. The second thing that's probably the key thing is the cyber judge. I mean, an expert system that whose purpose is to take as input all the relevant facts about an event and then to produce the final judgment without any subjective ingredient or any emotion or any cognitive bias. It's just like an algorithm. So we have to devise a very complicated algorithm and to implement it in a computer to see if any fact is compatible with the laws or not, and to get the result in like a few minutes and not like here in Italy, well, like in 10 years or 15 years to get the judgment or something. And finally, this would be useless unless humans, before the machines, devise a way to build a new law, a completely new law, under the constraint that it should be perfectly computable. Because if you don't understand that computability is a formal prerequisite of any possible future perfect law, we end up just replicating the mistakes we have been doing in the last 50 years, So producing a code and laws that are very vague and that cannot be processed automatically. So with these three tools, we can think that we can really fix the gap between what is the imperfect administration of law now and what would be the perfect administration of law approaching singularity.
Indipendentemente cerchiamo di fare una cosa più per studiare l'inglese che conviene, perché almeno insomma.
Okay, so very quick. I'm going to address 4 challenges. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list by any standard, but it's just 4 questions that comes to mind when you start thinking about this framework of the law and the time of singularity. So we have basically the first problem. There is the problem of computability. So if we said that okay, we can have just a perfect law if we have computable laws, but of course we know that not everything is computable because there are limitative results. Back in the 30s, stating that you cannot compute everything. So what is the trade-off? How can you solve this problem? And our answer is basically that the computation required to administer the law, so the detective AI or the cyber judge, it's going to be the computation is going to be perfectly computable because we are going to assume that we are living in a digital universe. That means we're going to assume that Ed Franklin or Stephen Wolfram or other people that proposed the model of universe as a cellular automata are basically right. So we're going to assume that reality is discrete at its fundamental level, both in space and both in time. And so the nature is finite. So the amount of information contained by nature is finite. So that guarantees that you can have a computable universe. So the second is that is very frequent, especially among the laymen, is that who guarantees you that when you build an artificial intelligence, this will be like benevolent? Why they should not take all the words and maybe kill all humans or something like that? And the answer is that I don't think you can be sure on what will be like, on what very intelligent machine will do. What we can know is that if we are able to develop cognitive enhancement for humans, just as we develop more intelligent machine, is unlikely that machine will be like much better than human, even when they get self-consciousness or something like that. So there will be not really 2 classes of system, one which is much more powerful than the other, but we should have something like equal classes. And so it will be not productive for machines to make war to humans because we will be like kind of similar. So it will be it will be more productive to seek in collaborations between the 2 classes. And third, this is very quick, is the mind extended problem that my colleague Marta introduced before, is the very fact that if we're going to tolerate fragmentation in egos, we are going to at least partially redefine what is going to be being responsible for an action. Because it's not like you're not just responsible for your own bodies and you're like very proximal part of you, but you're going to be responsible of very remote part of yourself and their behavior maybe in other universe or so on. So this would be like a very fertile field for philosophers of mind and ethics to explore what kind of future scenarios are possible in this respect. And finally, to conclude, and maybe this is the most practical advice we're going to give today, is what we call the principle of inversion. So basically, an objection may be, okay, if you start making judgment completely automatic, if you start just letting computer decide what is right and what is wrong, you're going to almost eliminate all the subjective point of view in human agency, because everything becomes perfectly objective. Everything becomes just you did it, or you did this, or you did that, and then from that you are going to deduce the punishment. So you're going to erase a big part of what today is the law, that is intentions, that is what an agent wants to bring about with his action. In our view, this is, we take the objection and showing that the current understanding of the law is flawed. So we believe that in the near future, intentions, so what an agent would want to bring about with his action, are going to completely disappear from how the law is administered. So basically the point is really objective. So what you're going to see is that if you make me some kind of damage, and to quantify that damage independently of any consideration about what you wanted to do when you first take your action. So you're not going to be blamed more if you wanted to make me a damage, or to be blamed less if you didn't want to make damage. So the only point is that the first perspective is the victim point. So from the point of view of the victim, it doesn't really matter if you really wanted to bring her harm or not to bring her harm. What is matter is that you have to compensate the victim for the damage you made. So if it is true that the subjective part of agency will be completely eradicated from how the justice is now administered, for us, this is like a very good part of the proposal. This is like an optimal part of how the law should be administered. So the victim point is the first part, and then we can see what can we do with the people who caused damage in the first place. So I think that's all, and maybe if you have some question, we can.
Before everyone starts asking questions, because this is the very typical issue that there's usually a lot of debate about this. I would invite everyone to take advantage of the fact that the email address of Marta and Jacopo is written here, and ask one or maximum 2 questions to leave time for the rest of the program. So who has the first question? Giuseppe?
Io in italiano,
Sì.
questa idea del danno alla vittima, diciamo, però è nel caso di un omicidio, è abbastanza limitativa, perché può essere anche intenzionale, colposo, volontario. Come diciamo, riuscire a gestire questa situazione?
Sì, sì, anche questo è disponibile. No, so the question was that take for example homicide. And nowadays we used to distinguish when an homicide is committed with a purpose to commit homicide, and when it's committed like by accident or as a side effect or other action. So how can this model handle this kind of thing?
La nostra risposta è abbastanza semplice, si perde la differenza, cioè l'unica cosa che conta davvero è il risultato, quindi ciò che è successo, indipendentemente dalle intenzioni, cioè l'effetto, la parte intenzionale, quindi pensiero, percezione, tutta quell'area in cui che non è direttamente visibile se non negli effetti, viene totalmente eliminata.
Quindi dove vi posizionereste sull'omicidio per esempio colposo oppure intenzionale, non distinguendo, cioè una pena massima o minima?
Questo sarà ovviamente all'infinito. Cioè, tralasciamoci, certo.
È una bella differenza.
No, certo. Sì, sì.
So the answer is that basically we take this at face value, so we don't distinguish more. We not we're not going to distinguish between these two kind of like homicide by accident and homicide by purpose, because there's of course this poses problem. This makes problem for the actual how we actually conceive our action as human. But think about the future where our cognitive power and the computational power is renounced. So there will be no more excuses for me not to be like aware of the even unintended consequences of my action. So because my ability to predict the future based on my current experience will be much more higher. So the damage that I cause is much more heavier for the society. Is really a problem. So.
This opens one very problematic situation, because a crime can be committed right now if people in this room live, like say, 100 years from now. So then certain consumption patterns and certain behavioral patterns right now might be considered or construed to be a crime. For instance, who really powerfully consumes or is manager of an oil industry might 50 years from now, by logical calculation, be regarded as being criminal. And that person might be held accountable and have to pay for severe crimes.
Yes, so what's the objection to this kind of...
This is an implication, basically what you're saying.
Okay.
Is that true, or am I mistaken?
So I'm not sure I get the point. So the point is that if you can predict that damage made now will result...
a very cautious and careful analysis of crimes in this manner. Put an AI to calculate crimes and come to a sort of a perfect statistical analysis of what a crime is, and a perfect or optimal ethical ideal of analysis, and you combine it with the fact that maybe some of these people might live more than 100 years, then people right here might be held accountable to crimes which we can't even define yet, or which are plausible but rather abstract from our perspective.
Okay, so you're going to say that we are kind of committed to the idea that we, like some sort of minority report things, like the fact that we can predict, like starting from now, that what it's going to be, so they can be held accountable now. From...
Say you buy a lot of art, 50 years ago, you are held accountable for being accomplice to slavery.
That's retroactive.
Right?
That's a retroactive law.
No, you can create crimes after the fact. You can create, for instance, if someone dumps a new toxic substance.
I think the issue has been stated.
Yeah.
Let's not make a debate out of this, because we will stay here until tomorrow. I think Didier wants to make a comment, but make it quick. Otherwise, we are going to have another quick comment from Riccardo, and after that, we are going to have a question from Nasha Vitamori in the virtual audience, and that's it. Yes. So Didier first.
I will try to be short. Just for me, it's a very strange idea that you are proposing as a conclusion. And on the other side, with new technologies, it will be possible to detect if the person, it will be a lot easier to detect if the person is lying or not. So why don't you choose this solution to be more to have new technologies to make it possible to know if the person is lying or not, and so to have more justice.
Actually, we think that the point of lying is very important in the future society, and we didn't touch the substantial point of view, and we just make the formal, but we believe that the first principle in the new society will be to never to lie, because if you're going to be in a future where our knowledge of the world will be constantly enhanced and improved, so the most important damage you can do to society is to lie, so to describe reality as it's not. So of course, a lot of technology will help us bring us there. So what we're saying is that if we detect that you're lying, that doesn't make you ipso facto like punishable, or that makes ipso facto make you like makes you make evident that you make a damage to me. So this is part of the detective eye tools that we were thinking about. So a machine that could detect that if you lie is very important, as well as a machine that could detect it if you were in a room like yesterday or whatever. So it's part of the big picture in the use of technology to aid the administration of law.
One question.
Make it very quick.
All right. Interesting talk. Thank you. From the viewpoint of me as a lawyer, you shouldn't. There's one. You recognize that that there will be sort of a meeting between machine capability and human capability through enhanced means. Who knows who will say this judgment whether it be enhanced humans or tin cans? But these will be subject to cost. These will be subject to accountability equally. I sort of admire your strive towards perfection and your will towards a perfect law in the form of argument. But whether this is attainable still remains to be seen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we don't have to prove that this kind of picture is really coherent in its finer grain or detail. What I can say to you is that if you're going to like pursue this line of thought and to even achieve like 1/10 of the thing, this thing will be a real improvement in our work. So maybe it's worth trying with this tree, because even if we cannot attain the final goal, we have always just to gain about this kind of consideration. And even if we cannot have a cyber judge, maybe the massive use of expert system in the administration of law could be really useful nonetheless. So I think, I mean, if we're very lucky, we can end up with the whole picture. But even if we got a fraction of it, I think it's worth it.
A good answer can emphasize.
Excuse me, we are not going to have a debate because we don't have time. Try to give the floor to Riccardo for the next comment.
Very quickly, I quite agree with this point of view. I started my career as a philosopher, and I was writing about trying to build a system of deontic logic together with many other more important philosophers than me, like from Britain and others, or a logic normative system. And the final conclusion after many years of working is that this is impossible. It's just that it's really, at least now, of course, in the future, maybe we will have better brains and better machines, but at the moment we cannot create a machine logical system. But then I would like to thank you for this intervention, because basically sometimes when people talk about the singularity, they talk about like paradise on earth, and they don't even take into account the fact that there will be criminals or new crimes or other types of behavior that someone likes it or other some people don't like it. Not like it. I remember, for instance, Frank Hitler speculating about the only point. I don't know if you read these books, so I don't know if it's assimilated to the singularity or something similar. And he was questioned by a journalist, John Hogan, and he asked him, so your machines, your super intelligent machine will resurrect everybody in the future. You remember, you know about him, Hitler. And he said, yes, of course. And the question of the journalist about, will he resurrect also criminals? I don't know, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, so what will be going on then inside the machines and so on? And he was really, and then think about it. Well, maybe yes, but we should modify these characters, you know. So I was really embarrassed about this. The thing is, I don't think that we will ever have this paradise on earth. So it's good, it's interesting talking also about crimes and problems and things like that.
Thank you very much for the comment, Riccardo. Since we have to move on, we have one more question from Natasha Tagliabue in the internet audience, and then we have to move on to the rest of the program. Can you read Natasha's question?
Yes. Natasha asks, we often speak of unintended consequences. However, with AGI, it seems that intended consequences are of equal significance. How do you view intended consequences in building the architecture for our future and its laws?
Basically, I think this is like some sort of continuity between this question and the question by Giuseppe. So the point is that we're not denying the fact that there's a difference between unintended consequences and intended consequences. And we're not saying that this will play no role in our future. What we're saying is we know that it's something strong, but we're saying that this difference will play no role in how the law will be administered, so in our view of justice. So what we'll say is that since we are taking into account first the victim point, so the fact that it gets damaged or did not get damaged, so the intended consequence or unintended consequence of the people that make, in the first place, the action are irrelevant to the fact that the damage should be someone who paid for, or that someone who made the damage should be punished. Okay.
Is that it? She had to read? One little more.
You were talking inside the wrong microphone, right? I think they can.
This is what she answered to it.
What did she answer? I cannot read it. Can you read it for me?
Her answer is, so he's saying that behavior is insignificant and looking at law as black and white. And then she goes, I meant to say intention. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's also for Natasha. We are not going to have a time to have a debate here. I would like just to add that my own opinion is not very different from that just expressed by Natasha. But I want to end by thanking very, 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 very much Marta and Jacopo. Now, it is very evident that many people wanted to say something and we didn't have time. This is an issue, it's very hot and it's going to become hotter and hotter. The emails of Marta and Jacopo are here. Marta and Jacopo at ilabs.it. I think you will accept receiving questions from participants. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Okay, now I have to introduce next speaker. And in order to save time, I'll try to do some parallel processing and doing it while I load the next presentation at the same time. The next speaker is Randal, who is normally, who is usually associated with the idea of mind uploading. We have been discussing a lot of mind uploading in these days, and Randal has recently coined some new terminology for this. He has been speaking of advancing substrate-independent minds, which is the name of a program, a very interesting one, which is being done under the umbrella of a foundation that has been set up called Carbon Company. Randal, you have the floor. Here, please. You're familiar with Mac probably, you know inside that already, you're not familiar with Mac. So I think I should go to slideshow mode and you just use the iMessage. Okay.
Okay, hi. Actually, I'm feeling quite bad that I haven't seen so many of the other talks that came before this, because when I was just listening to the talks that I just happened to listen to, they're quite interesting. So I'm going to make sure that everything I missed in those 26 hours that I spent flying here, I'm going to look at the recordings and find out what was there. So as Julia already said, usually people expect me to talk about advancing substrate-independent minds or mind uploading, whole brain emulation, something like that. And I'm really happy that this time I have the chance to talk about something more specific, just because it's fun to do. So I'm a 25-watt biocomputer, and what are the hacks that make us who we are? Oh, I'm using page down, and it's not. So
no. Right.
Right?
No?
No, not that.
Oh.
This must be a special package. Okay. Oh, I guess I'm like that. So. Yes, that doesn't seem good.
Okay, so the problem is the computer representation of both.
Yeah. Oh, press function key as well. Okay. Yeah. This is Macintosh is going backwards from its promise of having to use only one button. Right. So what are these hacks? Oh, and now suddenly it goes straight to the end of the presentation. So this is very weird. Oh, so function that it brings me to the very end. Ah, this is good. Okay, thank you. So why emphasize minds? I'm sorry if I mumble or if you can't hear me or don't understand something, just say so. I know the audience is largely Italian, so English is not your native language.
No,
No, it's not.
mostly English.
Oh, mostly English.
Yeah,
interesting. Well, nevertheless, interrupt me when you like, because I like those kinds of talks where I get interrupted, rather than just powering through. So I wanted to start just by backtracking a little bit on why do we do anything that we're doing here? Transhumanism, for example. Why do we do this? Well, one reason to do it is the title here, to extend life and enable more. Think, for example, that we want to be able to live a long life and still be able to do things, be aware of stuff, protect ourselves against risks. We want to continue to grow and to learn many things, and we still want to be able to relate to other entities or to things outside of ourselves. And now the question is, why do any of these things matter? Why do we care about living longer or continuing our growth and things like that? Basically, it's because we perceive. And that's, of course, not something new. Leibniz already made this a very important point to consider, perceiving and perception and how does it work. And, well, obviously this is something that happens in the mind. So I think that basically everything we're striving for is something that carries on, that goes on in our minds. And that's the most important aspect of what's going on. Every time you perceive something, a bunch of things start being processed in there, highly complex situation. There are some original drives that are inside us, biological drives that have been put there through evolution. And together this processing and the drives that are driving us to do a certain thing, to strive for certain goals, leads us to carry on actions that are the consequences of what we perceive. And all of this together, okay, one thing that emerges from this is, for example, self-awareness. It's this concept that we're aware of what's going on around us, that these perceptions relate to some sort of self, and that we are then acting as a self on the universe around us. Now, there's a whole school of thought that says that this is illusory, that self-awareness, consciousness, those things, they're not real, they're emergent phenomena. I'm not actually against that. In fact, I'm probably in that school of thought. It's just that I don't quite see the point. Are they any more illusory than anything else that we give a name to in the mind? Is there anything about other general functions that we have given a nice definition that is not an emergent thing, that is not something illusory in that sense? Take John Searle's argument about the Chinese room. This is kind of a little tangent, but it's always important from the AI point of view. Okay, there's this little person sitting in the room, or maybe it's a big person, translating Chinese just by following rules. And then the counter-argument against John Searle, who says that this shows that the computers can never really understand something, is that, well, why are you putting a person in there? That's kind of that's totally fake to do that, because you can't take a part of this mind, say the neuron, and assume that it is itself a person and needs to understand everything that's going on around it. That's one way of looking at it. So again, there's this, this dichotomy between emergent functions, giving it a name, and then thinking it's something very special. So what is this self stuff? Self stuff, I don't think there is any self stuff. There's no secret ingredient any more than there was an animated spirit that made things alive, which was something that was, of course, a hot topic of debate a century, 2 centuries ago. And so there's really, this is where we're saying there's not something mystical about it. There's no secret ingredient. There are a set of observed or perceived characteristics. Okay, these are what we know of. And then we give them some shared concept, some definition of what they are. And once we do that, we start to identify things like that. We identify things that are alive, things that are thinking and self-aware. And once you start doing that, then you can start to imbue that with a unique mystique. And that's where things start getting interesting, because then you've got the, oh, is there something special about self-awareness? Okay, but the point here is that what emerges here depends on the observer to classify it. It's because we happen to classify it like this that we say self-awareness is something special, something in particular that we'd like to preserve or do something. Okay, so what? Do we care? Are our goals, desires, or interests any more or less significant or influential with regard to our actions depending on whether there is the mystery or the illusion? So this is, what I'm kind of getting towards in the first part of this talk, which is, do we need to care about why we're striving for the goals that we're striving for? Does it really matter in the end whether something like that is an illusion, preserving self-awareness, or whether it is? And I'm echoing David Chalmers here. David Chalmers here. If consciousness is an illusion, then the illusion is consciousness. Basically, it doesn't matter because this is what we would do anyway. I mean, this is just what we can choose as a local purpose. There is no universal purpose, but we can choose local purposes. Okay, so given that that is something that matters to us, even though we can't give it a really refined, universal reason why it matters to us, then why do we want to understand the matter? Okay, because knowledge is power. Whatever you understand more, you can leverage, you can use it better, you can improve it. And this means that we can get more out of our existence, out of being, and out of this stuff that we care about so much. For example, there's the argument about augmentation. We can improve the extent of our being, by that I mean we can survive longer. And, well, this is basically kind of the first part of the talk. Let's start to learn what we can learn about the mind to get us there. Understand more about it, implement more, copy more, extend more, and diversify. Okay, so 2. How is the brain significant to this? I was just talking about the mind. I like to make a difference between the two, even, with my background and everything. I try to keep those two separate. Only separate insofar as I see the brain as an implementation of mind. I see the brain as an implementation of mind, a way of implementing functions, a certain kind of hardware. Okay, so thinking about thinking is basically what we're doing, because now we care about how the mind works, we want to understand something about it, maybe learn something from it. What happens when you start to care about something is that a whole bunch of fields of research start to emerge. And just to name a few, we have here psychology, psychiatry, where psychiatry, of course, is about what goes wrong in minds, what goes right, and why does it go right or wrong. Psychology, linguistics, and cognitive science, which you could call high-level approaches that look at the high-level characteristics of mind. And those are really interesting, because high-level stuff is the kind of stuff that matters to us in our lives. It's the kind of thing that we deal with on a daily basis that affects everything. So, if you've ever read David Deutsch's book, then you can see that he would agree that you don't only look at physics to understand what subatomic particles are doing, because it's really hard to understand why World War II happened if you just look at subatomic particles. So you need to know something about high-level things. Even louder. Okay, I thought it was already loud.
No, louder.
Louder.
These are important things, they need to be said loud. You see what I mean?
Just bring the microphone a little bit closer to your
Okay, let's start getting a little closer. I'm not too big.
No, the
this is
microphone.
this is the mic. Speak right down. Okay, here. Okay. Then another area, neuroscience, which is more my area, computational neuroscience, in fact, and then neuroinformatics, which is more the novel version of computational neuroscience, in which case it's about understanding what mechanisms make it work. So you're diving a little deeper. And then on the other hand, instead of thinking about thinking from the point of view of how does it work inside this gray matter that's inside our brains, there's the artificial intelligence approach and other things like embodied cognition in robotics. Pattern recognition, machine learning, probabilistic computing, which in this case are mechanisms for formal architecture, whereas the artificial intelligence itself are ways of describing in a formal and pure way how to implement high-level characteristics of thinking. Okay, so this is kind of what it all split out into. The brain. So what's so special about the brain? One useful thing about the brain is that it exists. And that's something that is often forgotten, believe it or not. When I talk to people who do a lot of AI, I sometimes think that they've forgotten that the brain exists. And I don't mean this is a bad thing, because they're looking at it from another angle, and I can get back to that later. It also appears to work. At least it works for the kinds of problems that we cared about back in the Stone Age, and to some degree still for the things that we care about now. Those are two really important advantages, because you've got a system there that you can actually look at, and that seems to work to a certain degree. So let's see what the brain's comments are about those fields I just described. Okay, psychiatry. Well, the brain can help us find out what we need to know about brain health if we actually examine the brain and learn something about it. Using the brain as an example, in psychology and cognitive science, we can use this as a way to understand ourselves, to understand better why we do the things that we do. And in neuroscience, well, obviously, this is the place where you can look at the actual mechanisms underlying thinking. What kind of mechanisms do you implement to do these things, to do that in thought processes? And then, well, the artificial intelligence area, they owe a lot to the brain. First of all, you can use it as something to compare and contrast with. If you work in artificial intelligence and you're trying to create thinking machines, you can compare what you're achieving with what humans do. And obviously, there's, you can have a human chess player against a computer and things like that. There are other things you can do as well. And mostly, the brain has taught us a lot of interesting tricks that are now used in artificial intelligence. For example, the origin of distributed computing, the origin of the notion of probabilistic reasoning, the origin of the concept of reinforcement learning, the origin of the subdivision of memory and types of different representations. There are other influences there as well, but the brain was an example that showed us that we can use all of these principles for thinking. And then, of course, if you have the brain's comments, you always have Pinky's comments. I don't know if you know this, but this is a very popular little cartoon in the United States. So, Pinky's comments. Well, but it's so messy. That's sad. It's true. There is no single algorithm for general intelligence in the brain. But is it really that diverse? Well, I think it probably is. It's certainly not the result of having designed something according to one specific set of design principles. But it does serve the same goal. Each iteration of brains, let's say from early simple brains in invertebrates to the brains that we see in primates to brains that we have, they all serve the goal of survival. But in changing conditions, and the most important aspect of those changing conditions has been that your competitors are getting better. So it's all in an area of competition. The brains are not optimized to be general, to be best in all circumstances. Instead, they developed according to a shortest path optimization. You simply keep adding something that makes you a little bit better. This sort of adaptation through augmentation, which is really not much different than when we augment ourselves now, well, it's not the same as a cautious approach. We'd say if you make the best general system, it will always work in every other circumstance, and then you can try to optimize within that circumstance. But the good thing is that the way evolution works, only the winners are around, so we don't really have the losers to contend with, and so the principle seems to work fairly well in an environment where the fittest survive. Okay, the path of diversity. This is really getting down into what I'm trying to talk about in the brain here. Well, what kind of diversity do we see here? Here's some examples. The brain is really not like artificial general intelligence with a simple algorithm. You see many different cell types, many different kinds of operation, different sorts of signaling. For example, muscles are generally controlled by sort of a sum of vectors that tell the muscle which direction to move in. You've got different neural signals that are being added up in a vector. With their auditory sensing, where a single spike can indicate very important information about the frequency of the signal that we just heard. There are different kinds of representations. In some areas, it's highly distributed. You could shoot a bullet through part of the brain, and you will forget only part of what you knew, and you won't forget all of it. Like maybe your memory of what your grandmother looked like is a little more vague, but you could still recognize her. Whereas in other areas of the brain, it's a very sparse representation. You basically have grandmother cells, those cells that are indicators for the concept of your grandmother. And why that is, well, there are different reasons for it. We'll get into it in just a second. There are also different arrangements. You have different parts of the system. Like you have the older limbic system and the newer neocortex that have completely different architectures. And you see that in different species, for example, even within an area like, say, the neocortex, you'll see that they have different numbers of layers. You'll see within brain regions in our own brain that we have different arrangements. For example, just counting the number of layers, in some areas of our brain you'll have 5, and in some you'll have 6. So, one important question is, are we just adding refinements, as in, are we adding new, better, refined systems to the old system and keeping what's there, like the limbic system, in place for backward compatibility? So does that basically stay the same and then we just add other parts? Okay, so something changed after that. That was just removed, because now I've come on to page 4. Maybe the USB card was important.
I thought you were not running it from USB, because they hold you to this.
Maybe it is.
No, I think there's just a phone.
Okay. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, thanks. Okay. So, the next slide, recycle. So it's really not just a matter of adding new systems but keeping the old ones the way they work. As an example, let's look at the hippocampus, which happens to be an area that I've studied a lot, so it's easy for me to talk about. In rats, when we talk about the hippocampus, we're mostly talking about spatial capability, learning about spaces and running around and finding a way through mazes and things like that. And it seems that it's very much oriented towards those tasks. But in other animals, and especially in higher primates and in humans, we see that the hippocampus is involved in all sorts of interesting tasks, mostly in acquisition of declarative memory, which is a really important thing to us. Declarative memory is, of course, this kind of memory where we can really pick on something, we can really pick out an item that we want to think about and use it. So it's not like procedural memory where we learn how to play piano and we can just do it. It's the memory that we think about and that we act on consciously. So this ancient system helps us to develop concepts and is therefore crucial for some of what we consider the highest human forms of intelligence. So this is, the hippocampus is in the limbic system. It's one of the older parts. But it works together with the neocortex, which is basically like a huge reservoir computing environment that can classify and carry out tasks where you classify concepts and things like that. Is part of the automated and unsupervised mechanism that we use to deal with the grounding problem. So altogether, this helps us deal with new concepts, add new concepts, associate with one another, keep those that we care about for long-term storage, etc. And just to show you how complicated it gets, I'm showing you here how declarative memory is acquired. And I've tried to describe that in 3 dimensions, the where, as in how is it stored in the brain? Is it local or is it distributed? And in terms of mechanisms, what kind of strange mechanisms is it using to store memory? And in terms of the time period, how long does it last? Well, you see the first green box, short-term memory, this is based on, well, first of all, you've got input that's coming in at arbitrary intervals. You don't know if things are going to happen 1 second apart, or if there's going to be an event now, then an event 5 minutes from now, and an event an hour from now. Somehow you need to be able to relate these things over different periods of time. You need to somehow stack time together and still keep events ordered. And there are mechanisms to do this using rhythmic activity that don't depend at all on synapses, for instance. So I'm actually going to show an example of that in a second. Then you've got the intermediate term memory in the hippocampus, which is using chemistry, or chemical storage, LTP, long-term potentiation, and coincidental recruitment to establish new patterns. together with the dentate gyrus, which has this wonderful property that there's a lot of neurogenesis going on there. So you have a lot of fresh cells that aren't associated with anything yet. I'm very happy to make new associations. They can be used as concept tags. And then we're going further in time. This is now the LTP may last for days, whereas the short-term memory lasted only for seconds and minutes. Then you get to, well, storage. You want to store this intermediate-term memory somewhere for long-term memory. And to do that, well, we use a replay of the memory. And this happens, for example, a lot during sleep when we have slow-wave sleep. We see that the same activity, the same patterns are reactivated in the hippocampus, and they take place in the same order, but they're interleaved with other activity that's happening elsewhere in the brain. And so we get this reactivation that allows the memories to be transferred and stored, established elsewhere, which eventually leads to changes that are not just chemical, but are also morphological, where new synapses are grown. So you see in long-term memory that there are actual morphological changes in the brain. Last a lot longer, and they can basically connect anything in any part of the brain with any other part of the brain. So, very different systems. Different, okay, yeah, that's good. This is just a quick slide showing you the short-term memory buffer. This happens to be something that I modeled for a while, and how it works, just because this is totally different from what we're used to seeing in artificial intelligence. It's totally different from what we normally think about in computers and how it works. What we have here are, well, if you look at the middle graph, you just see that there are a bunch of spikes, and you can change the mode in which the neuron operates. Usually it will spike only once or a few times after it's received input, but if you give it acetylcholine, it can spike persistently. So you've changed it into a different type of device. And then on the left, all these colorful little lines show you what happens when you receive input at a certain time. You receive an event, something happens, there's a pattern that occurs. And these spiking neurons, they can keep that active without having any synaptic connections, any pre-existing synaptic connections. That's very important if you're trying to acquire new memory, because you don't know what you're supposed to wire with what else. And you can keep multiple patterns going at the same time, in the same order, because of a certain arrangement of how the hippocampus is wired and how it sustains activity at the same time as it blocks the activity from just going on continuously, because there are these other cells, interneurons, that will cause activity to die down right after you've had the set of spikes. So I'm not going to go into more detail about it, but you see that this is quite different from what you might look at in a computer program. And yet it achieves something very fundamental. Similarly, well, I could go on about how you reinforcement learning, neocortex, but I'm not going to do that because I've already done that talk back in March, I believe, and it's online in video, so you can look at it there. Okay, so we have a bunch of different systems. It's quite diverse. Feasibility. Why is it so important to have these different systems? Well, we live in an environment where resources aren't always equally distributed, and some resources are much harder to come by than others. For example, food may be something that is difficult to come by. In other words, energy, something to supply all these watts that you would need if you were to run some very uniform type of system that needs to emulate a whole bunch of processes. Some improvements are cheaper than others. For example, when you're doing evolution, or let's say if you were trying to come up with a way to increase what a brain can do, it can be very easy to add more cells that are exactly like the cells that are already there, or to simply add another layer to the brain. So some things are cheap, some things are easy to do. There are simple mutations. Other things are much harder. If you want to come up with a very smart algorithm, that's very difficult. And then there's the matter that capabilities in competing species co-develop. That's an automatic consequence of the competition, because many of your competitors who are not as good as you are actually eliminated simply through that competition. So if they didn't keep up, gone. Just as an example, one of the principles that result from this is lazy computation and empirical evaluation. What you end up with is hardware that reacts quick enough, for example, for the medium brain. Like, let's say you're a fish and you're swimming in water. You're quick enough to be able to move away from your predator before you're eaten. And you're doing this in an environment by receiving continual feedback. So you're not really pre-computing everything that you need to do. It's just that you are making small changes then looking at what the environment is giving back to you and making another computation. It's constant feedback. So what you don't really end up with is decisions being made based on circuitry that is calculating things precisely from beginning to end, predicting what's going on in terms of current flow, resistance, energy reserves, ballistic curves, etc. It's not how the organisms generally work, although in some cases perhaps that's exactly what does occur as a result of evolution. But I don't know exactly which one to point out there. But what I'm saying here is the environment is being used as part of your computation, as your computer. And that's how you're being lazy. You're just using the environment for empirical evaluation. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty, what the title is about. 4 pages. So why does our hardware manage at 25 watts? One is this principle of lazy offloaded computation, where you're using the rest of the universe as part of your brain. The other is, okay, emergent atom state. Unlike a computer, where you may lose a lot if you turn it off, if you whack us on the head and you don't do too much damage, or if we lose our state for a moment, a sensible state returns, maybe not at exactly the same point, but most of the memory is still there and we still function in a normal way. We're not suddenly crazy. There's also the static or hardware memory. So unlike most of the memory now, where you either have to load it from a hard disk and put it into RAM, and the RAM disappears if you turn off the power, most of our memory is static. It doesn't rely on constant refresh, etc. Then there's the event-triggered clockless, or mostly clockless, activity of the brain. Basically, neurons just wait to see when something comes up. They don't have to constantly fire. And in fact, you can measure when this isn't the case. So when we're not working in a clockless state, when we do have working memory going on with this short-term buffer that I was just talking about, you can actually see the increased power consumption. And how I've measured this in patients who were undergoing surgery to find out where the source of epileptic seizures was in their brain. So they did intracranial EEG studies, and they measured the power at different lengths of lists that they had to remember, and you could see that the power was going up proportionally. We'll say 5, 6, 7, 8 items in the list. Tuning by relative phase, not by rate. So a lot of what goes on in our brain is spike-based. It's not based on frequency or on rate. Analog summation and multiplication, rather than a precise digital calculation, but something that's good enough analog. Nonlinear operation, which allows us to make decisions, because nonlinearity is good for finding thresholds. It also reflects very well on how the universe is put together. The universe is fairly nonlinear. So making use of what we see around us and being able to compute that also in nonlinear fractions seems fairly rational. Nanoscale architecture, and I'm not just talking about the size of neurons or synapses, because they're actually rather large. But I'm also talking about, say, the distance between adjacent synapses on a dendrite. This is all part of dendritic computation. It matters where exactly a synapse is and how it influences electrical conductance from another synapse. And we use different mechanisms best suited to a given scale. I was already talking about that earlier. And here, just as an example, take chemical diffusion for something that is supposed to diffuse, something that's supposed to be slow, broad, and it's supposed to last. Use electrical propagation for speed and precision, and use morphological changes for lasting things that are supposed to be distributed, or that you need to be able to connect one part of the brain with any other arbitrary part of the brain. Also, blur lines of function, be opportunistic. Here, an example, a recent finding is that, well, the glia that we used to think were mostly just for life support and keeping neurons in good shape and cleaning up the environment around them, may be involved in some computation. They may be involved in part in feature extraction, sort of a reservoir computing function, as David Reed pointed out. Also, we use very small potential differences. It's millivolts that matter. And there's a slow local switching speed. So what the individual neurons do is not very fast. That also keeps the power consumption down, as well as doesn't heat up the brain too much. But we have very many cheap components, though, so even though they're slow, it's robust, and we don't need to care too much exactly how well one neuron works, because they can all work well together. So there are minimal design specification requirements. We do local computation, and we have lots and lots of cache, lots of memory. There's so much memory, in fact. Every neuron, every synapse has multiple types of memory residing right next to it. There's short-term potentiation, which is a type of memory that tells it how much it should still react to on new incoming signals. There's long-term potentiation, which I already spoke about, this chemical change that changes how strong a synapse is. And of course, there are morphological changes, just to name a few. And then, of course, there's the almost total, sometimes redundant, parallelization. Generally, when we try to make parallel systems, we try to think of how many CPUs do we need to run a problem well. We've got, 5 different threads, we want 5 different CPUs, something like that. But in the brain, we've got way, way more than that. We've got an overcapacity all the time. We use 1,000 or 1 million neurons to participate in a circuit action, and many of them are doing the same thing at the same time. So why does blue-brain consume kilowatts? This is, of course, a nice example, because blue-brain tries to do everything that a certain part of a small uniform part of a rat's brain is doing, and is trying to do it very well, trying to do this simulation with neurophysiological precision. Well, it's a uniform general-purpose hardware platform, first of all, and there are good reasons for that. It's emulating all of the specialized mechanisms that I just described before, and it's doing so in the time step. There is little to no attempt to match hardware substrates, architecture, or mechanism to function. So it's clear why it's consuming a lot more power. And I was just giving 2 other examples. Say, for example, you're doing simulated annealing. That's a case where you're specifically choosing to simulate something that otherwise the environment of the universe carries out everywhere in lots of ways, for free, basically. But you have to put a lot of effort in to simulate it. Whereas, say, if you use radioactive decay as a way of making a random generator, then you're kind of matching your hardware to your problem. You're using something that is happening in the environment to your advantage. Okay, so this leads us to those choices then, about what kind of processing you use. How well optimized and how universally adaptable is the brain actually? The kind of processes that we do, how good are they? Well, they're optimized to local purposes and they're constrained by the resources. We have limitations, of course, and just to list a few, here we go. It's very difficult to interpret, access, or fix, or replace, or modernize anything in the brain. This is a problem that I'm really, really unhappy with. I want to do something about it. It's really hard to do anything to just get in there, augment, or even just store it somewhere else. It's very hard to get at the brain. It's critically dependent on life support, so you can't just take a brain out of this skull and put it on a table. It won't still survive. You could also not take its entire body and just dump it on Mars. It just won't work. So it's critically dependent on a certain life support system. It's unadapted to competition in different environments or towards other goals, because it's been developed specifically by evolution towards functioning in this environment with these kinds of competing challenges. And of course, basically anything we're already using information tools for, like the fact that I write things down so that I don't forget them, and just the fact that I'm using this computer right now. All of these other tools are evidence that there are things that our brain is not perfectly optimized for. Almost all experience is an emergent condition that we accept as valid rather than something supported by a high-fidelity trail of evidence. What do I mean? Memory is terrible. I remember almost nothing from yesterday, and I wasn't drinking heavily. It's just that, most of what I remember is a complete construct. It's just something that's plausible. There are a few bits and pieces I actually remember, and the rest I put together because it seems plausible, and I say, oh, that must have been what that was. It's not real memory. And this bothers me more and more because I base my decisions and my judgments on this memory. So I don't really have a trail of evidence. I've got a trail of plausible things, and that's what I use for my judgments. Also, I'm localized in space. It's extraordinarily annoying that I can't be doing some of my processing here and some of my processing in Tokyo at the same time. So I would like to be able to be less localized in space. This is obviously a limitation. Localized in time. For some reason, our processes, brain processes, they're all things that are happening right now. It's all whatever we're computing at the moment. I cannot, for example, use a comparison of my brain state 3 days ago and my brain state now to do something sensible with that. So I don't have processing over time in that sense. We have very short-term memory. Most people know that already. And our long-term memory is incredibly fallible and very slow at acquiring things. Our processing rate is slow. We don't multitask well, especially when we have to use the same modality for multiple things, like say, seeing something, listening to something. We have what's called bounded rationality, which is our tendency not to estimate things very well. We either are way too optimistic or too pessimistic in our estimates. Although it seems that if you take a group of people, you can get a much better estimate. But I suppose that's just if you lump together a lot of pessimism and a lot of optimism, and you get something better. There are limits to our attention, or what we can attend to at one time. Limits of comprehension and sensory experience. Obviously, I have no idea what things look like in the X-ray spectrum. Okay, so, well, how well optimized, how linguistically adaptable? These are all domain-specific specializations that we have. This is what's caused our brain to be the way it is. And why is that a useful way of optimizing? Well, events can occur at arbitrary times and input can arrive at unpredictable intervals. We needed something to deal with that. And the brain does that very well, much better than most AI right now. High-level associated patterns change more slowly. This is something that is represented very well in the brain, and that many AI also still struggle with. They try to represent everything as changing at about the same pace. Meaning is derived from coincidence. Whatever fires together wires together. It's the Hebb principle. So coincidence is important. It can tell you something about causality. Reaction speed matches the limits of practical needed nature. Mostly that's true. It's getting a little more difficult now. Driving a fast car, reaction speed may not be enough. Perception matches the limits of what needs to be resolved and how much of the field at once. Also mostly true. And the majority of the situations that we're in require only one localization of attention at a time or one focus per modality. Although sometimes that can bite you if you have multiple predators coming at you from different directions or things like that. Okay, many possible solutions can be propagated to a winner-take-all action funnel. This is very useful because we don't have to pay attention to many things at the same time. We can use our resources to compute a lot of different solutions at the same time and then just pick the winner. We really usually only have to take care of one body in one location at one time. So the fact that we're localized in space isn't really a problem, and the fact that we have these limitations is usually also not a problem. But I've put down air traffic controllers as a counter example because we know that they have a very high burnout rate, and maybe that has something to do with that. They take care of a lot of different ones in one location at the same time. Okay, the type of I/O that we're used to and able to deal with are caused by events that we A, need to be able to deal with and do something about, and B, that we can do something about. What I mean is, okay, yes, we can deal with disturbances in our visual field or vibrations in the sand. We can react to that and do something about it, but we have really no reason to even be able to deal with gamma ray bursts, for example. There's nothing we can do to protect ourselves against that, or at least there wasn't in times that we were evolved. Entirely probabilistic, as in those events which are frequent and describe the kind of I/O that we've been receiving are responsible for the kinds of mechanisms that evolved. So basically, you use all those cheap ways of adapting yourself to evolve yourself towards a special purpose hardware. Generations really cost nothing since there's no deadline. So evolution could just keep on making new generations of things. So I'm almost there now. What do we learn from all this and brain's approach, the way to go? I would say yes and no. It really depends on the goal. If you're trying to optimize towards a domain, then yes, I would say co-processing hardware is the way to go. Do try to adapt your hardware to what you're trying to do. If you're trying to explore a domain, no. If you're prototyping, it can often be much better to have a flexible universal implementation and work with that. And I'll just jump right to the bottom line for a second there because I do this all the time. I'll use MATLAB, for example, because it's very easy to write something complicated on one command line and have it do something really complex quickly and easily for me, even though it's extraordinarily slow, because MATLAB is a very uniform platform, very non-optimized towards getting certain things done quickly. But it's good for prototyping versus, say, writing something in C or assembly language or putting it in an FPGA or an ASIC. But in the brain, you see the same kind of choices being made. There are parts of our brains that are more uniform, and they're used for processes where you can use a systematic part to make up an algorithm and keep things there temporarily. For example, the hippocampus and neocortex are both such areas. They have regions in which the cells are arranged in a very typical fashion. They can do a stereotypical type of function, and they don't always do this for the same things. They will be recycled, will be reused for new memories, new concepts, new computations. versus specialization in many other areas. So in our sensory regions, then we have very specialized parts of the retina, which are always used for the same purpose and are very hardware specific. Okay, so the last page then, hacking minds. And I'm basically just going to read this off the page. This is not just about equaling raw computation power of the brain, it's also about hacks and about taking shortcuts, smart shortcuts, in many cases utilizing computation that's not even carried out in the brain, but rather carried out outside for free. It's also about picking your implementations wisely. Consider hardware choices. Well, you've got CNS tissue, you've got neuromorphic hardware, reversible computing, which Anders, I believe, talked about for a moment ago, quantum computing, optical computing, GPUs, as well as, of course, our general typical silicon hardware. Of course, if you go deep enough into the hardware of the brain, eventually it all does become uniform. I mean, how could it not be the case, right? If you just keep on digging deeper, eventually you end up at protons and neutrons and things like that. I'm not saying you have to go that far, but certainly wherever it is uniform is a lot lower than neural networks. So it's not your artificial neural networks that's the typical uniform level. And then I just wanted to say that I'm really astonished and I'm stunned by the sorts of things that Anders talks about, and also that Marcus Hutter talks about with his IT, AGI, which are really about the extremes of what we can possibly achieve in terms of computation in the universe. And it's fantastic to think about. But what I wanted to address here, first of all, was just what we need to do or understand in this universe as we have it right now in order to at least equal and then exceed the kind of intelligent computation that already exists. If we want to upload ourselves to substrate-independent minds, there is the hard but universal exploratory route that you can take, say, for example, through emulated brain slices, and there is the hacked and messy but progressive route of gradual augmentation and uploading through that method. This sort of, again, looks at the two different kinds of hardware for different choices. So I would say there are things we can still learn from the way the brain works, and pick your choices, make your choices, pick your hardware carefully. That's it.
Since Randal is the last speaker who is actually here with us, I think we have time for a couple of questions at least before the last presentation by a speaker who is not here. So, who has the first question, Max?
This answer this question depends very much on having developed it. In terms of real compressive augmentations of the brain, what do you think are the most promising near-term pathways, say 10, 20 years? Do you see things like boosting new growth by using those vector, or building new pathways using narrow robots, or neutralizing external devices that we have in front of them and getting these exponential vector working on?
Well, I think that some things are, of course, low-hanging fruit in terms of technology, just because we already have some of it. So basically, you just take what we've already got with your iPhone and you just try to make it more and more easy to use. I mean, when we talk about augmentation, you have to go there first. It's not necessarily about plugging things into the brain. It's not necessarily about making any hardware changes. That's, of course, where we want to go. But realize that all of this is augmentation as well. And that's going to keep getting more easy to use and more all around us and attached to us, etc. But what I think also matters is whatever we really are more interested in. So, for example, when we say what's going to happen in the next 20 years, part of it depends on what I choose, for example, to work on, or what you choose to work on, what everybody chooses to work on. And I think, for example, one of the really interesting things are the kinds of technologies coming out of optogenetics right now. The fact that you can stimulate neurons without having to undergo surgery, without having to put in an electrode in just one specific spot or interpret something from a scan. I think the fact that you can affect a whole lot of neurons in a specific area, but only of a specific type, is really useful. So that's one example of a technology that I think that will become very useful for augmentation purposes. And then the reverse as well. Of course, you need something to be able to read out. And right now, that's still a harder problem. But I think there's something coming along in those same areas. So more in the area of, say, modification through vectors that you send into the axons and to the neurons. Implementing new channels, things like that. I think that's a really interesting area. Whereas right now we've really explored mostly how can you do external scans without something inside the body, like an MRI, or we've explored how to use electrodes that we were sticking to the brain somewhere. So anyway, that's one of the things I hope
The next question is Dave. I'd like to ask you, Randal, to repeat the question before answering.
Oh, okay, sure.
Dave.
Interesting talk. Did you identify substrate-independent lines with qualia-independent lines, qualia-phenomenal textures of consciousness? Because, by analogy, if you want to emulate a game of chess, the particular kind of textures of the pieces are irrelevant. What counts is the functional pattern. Even assuming, which I'm skeptical, that you can model the human mind brain as a classical digital computer, is there any particular reason to expect that the failure would be the same? And I think this is important because if they weren't, or they were absent failure, without, for instance, the pleasure-pain axis not defined phenomenologically, but in terms of the hedonic tone, in one sense, nothing would matter. Sorry.
You're jumping right back to my first stance,
Yes.
about what actually matters.
Yes.
Because you can debate that, of course. You could say, well, even if you make something without the kernel, you still have a wonderful new AI and it would be a beautiful thing to use. So some people might be happy with that. I wouldn't necessarily, so I'm with you on thinking it's important. I'll just repeat the question. You were asking, do I think that substrate-independent lines is also qualia-independent lines? I'm not exactly sure that I know what qualia are, first of all. I'm not entirely sure that this notion of qualia is very well substantiated. We can debate that later if you like. But let's assume for a moment that it is. Then I still wonder, let's say for example that we don't get rid of sensors. We don't get rid of bodies. Let's say we still have embodied cognitions and provide a body of some sort, or an environment that will give you input. Then what sort of qualia about individual neurons really matter? And let's say we were to replace just the neurons inside our brain, or just the neocortex or something like that, with a different hardware platform. Which qualia are we losing doing that? It's not clear to me that we're losing it. So as long as you are aware of the things that you are re-implementing when you're emulating something, and those things that you're leaving out, which you're doing for a reason, either because it's unfeasible or because you choose to leave it out, and I think you have a pretty good handle on the kinds of experiences and sensations that you still have, whether or not that corresponds to this much bigger notion of qualia.
Max?
Yeah, since when it goes around the singularity, that comes up a lot, and get your view on all these levels of understanding shown very well, very complexly within original understanding. Our range really seems to have been really used within a figured order set because of exponential improvements in scanning and so on. What is your view about this?
So Max is asking me what's my view on the timeline that Ray Kurzweil gives us for all this understanding that needs to be done. And Ray Kurzweil says within 30 years, is that what you?
Something like that.
Well, if he says 30, I'll say 20. No, I'm kidding. That's just everybody has to do this. You know, Henry Markram said he would build a brain in 10 years. Everybody's going down the curve. And I know how this works because I work for House and Molecular now. We're going to do whole genome scans for $10 in under 10 minutes. And, you know, okay. So I'm not going to go there really because I think that the time.
So I wasn't asking for your time, rather your comment on his methodology.
Oh, his methodology of how to. As long as he's not cherry picking the data that he's got, and that's something I don't know because I just haven't examined it. As long as he's not cherry picking his data, then it's just a statistical result, right? I mean, he's putting this on a graph, he's showing you what's happening and how fast it's been happening, and then he's extrapolating it and saying something about what he thinks will happen in the future. There are two things, of course. There's the possible cherry picking, which is a very typical, normal way of lying with statistics. And then there's also the question of whether he can predict what sort of developments are actually necessary to get to the understanding that we need, so whether or not they even lie in the functions that he's looking at. Also not entirely clear, but just because I'm not sure what he uses to make all of this, to come up with all of these graphs, and what exactly are his reasons for that, I don't feel that I should debate that, so I don't really know if it's how good he's going to be predicting that.
So a little bit going back to the beginning when you said, okay, if I can build a fantastic AI much better than myself in many ways, but I'm not so interested in perpetuating that AI necessarily. But imagine that you have built an AGI that you really respect. It has a lot of the qualities that you idealize. You take a massive anxiolytic, so you have no fear of death, and you just basically look at it and you say, on a merit-based system, this should be perpetuated a lot more than myself, and it's almost like frontal lobe damage. You do not have the anxiety of what's going to happen to me personally. You would just mathematically kind of say, that deserves to go on. I'm kind of full of those patterns of just my ideas going forward. Forget about scanning and accuracy and what part of me and what memories these are just my ideals. That's good enough for me. Can you ever see yourself getting to that point?
Okay, so Tudor's basically asking me, if we were to create an artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence that is in some ways, or appears to be in some ways superior to us, and we would find that ideally good enough that it should just continue, we could somehow avoid our own fear of death and just say, no, it should just go on instead of us, couldn't that be just fine? Or what is my reasoning for thinking otherwise, or whichever. Anyway, I'll just go into that now. First of all, I'm not sure what sort of goals an AGI should strive for. Like a fantastic AGI, the best you can possibly think about, what is its purpose? What are its goals? Like, how does it even determine those? Most of our goals are set up through drives that are just the result of evolutionary pressure. And I don't know what is perfection or what is just, the ideal in that sense for an AGI. Unless it, I mean, we could have it follow the same kinds of drives that humans are following, but I don't think that that's what you were looking for. So I'm not quite sure what that is, first of all. So I don't know how we identify such.
You would determine those goals to be sufficiently idealized by you.
Okay, so they are basically human goals. You're saying we would determine,
choose,
so there are human goals. So it's whatever we think is good to be good at, and determine it is really good at that, and therefore it's fantastic, it's better. Then I can assume that there will be some people who indeed think that that is the way to go. I don't think that everyone has the same opinion, and I don't think everyone shares my views about, basically being part of the machine that goes forward rather than making machines and letting them go forward. In fact, I'm not even sure there's going to be a big difference 1,000 years from now between an AGI that's developed for 1,000 years or an upload that has, basically merged with a lot of machine capabilities and developed for 1,000 years. I think that what it comes down to is this question of what is our purpose, why do we do these things? And since the purpose isn't a universal given, and I don't really know why I should create an ideal AGI and let it go on without me, that's just not my purpose, so I don't choose that. But I'm not saying that it's there for a specific reason. It's not really rational. It's just based on choice.
Last.
This is right now mostly academic research for curiosity purposes. That means it is not fully marketable right now. Maybe there's some spin-off in the medical applications. But do you foresee in the next 20 years a moment when there is some kind of marketable model in this field, and that a lot of more money might flow into this field?
And you were asking whether or not there would at some point in the relatively near future be something marketable, some kind of spin-off that's related to this whole idea of substrate-independent transloading emulation, offloading this whole area. That's a really big question because there's so many things that fit into that area. It's hugely multidisciplinary, and a lot of things are happening all over right now that are actually working towards that. And I could say that there are already marketable spin-offs that are being produced right now based on this kind of work. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to talk about this because I think I signed an NDA. But anyway, there is a certain someone who is very well known in the neuroscience community who has developed models of a certain part of the brain and is now implementing them for a certain very large manufacturer of chips who wants to use something of what the brain can do very well. So, without giving away any details, there are already ideas for spin-offs from some of this kind of thing. Yes.
And we have now the very last question by Natasha Vitamot. I will ask Kim to read it aloud.
Okay, Natasha asks, can you give us your understanding of what personhood is and how it relates to SIM? If this question was oh no, that's in parentheses.
Okay, so she's asking what is my opinion of personhood and how does it relate to SIM?
SIM.
SIM.
Substrate independent.
Oh, okay. It's completely different from what I thought. Okay. How does personhood relate to substrate independent minds? Okay. My view is that, yeah, gosh, okay, what is personhood again? Are we talking about personal identity or self-awareness or consciousness? I guess that would be the first question back.
Well, she's typing right now,
Yeah.
and she's hearing you, so let's see.
I discussed that with Natasha by email. She just doesn't want to give up. She just doesn't want to acknowledge that there is no such a thing as a well-defined person. Anyway, we have discussed that with Natasha. We go to hear Randal's answer now.
I was hoping that she was talking about singing because I wanted to get back to the. I wanted to get back to the previous talk, the one about lying and getting rid of lying in the future. But maybe I can talk to people about that later. So that was a different view. So what was Natasha saying now about
okay, she rephrased it as, what do you think personhood is? Consciousness and or mind?
Ah, okay. What is personhood in terms of consciousness or mind? I think that personhood is whatever I define that I am right now. So basically, I'm functioning. There's something that's going on here, giving me perceptions, and I use that to act on, and this sort of feels like me. So it must be everything, first of all, that's being processed in my mind. So all the brain, all the brain's processes, first of all, are involved in this. And yes, I'm conscious. If you want to define anything as consciousness, it's certainly what we're perceiving right now. I'm with David Chalmers on that one. So I think that's also relevant and important. Yeah, that's personhood. And okay, so how does that relate to substrate independent minds? I think it relates totally, because I wouldn't be satisfied with the goal. Let's say I would not say that substrate independent minds has been achieved unless you can achieve all of that in there as well.
Quick follow-up to that. David, what percentage of that person that you just defined, that person that you just defined, would you say is unique to you and not shared by probably all of us in the room?
Okay, so Tudor is asking what percentage of the person that I just defined is unique to myself rather than to everyone else in the room. I'm going to have to throw out a guess because I haven't calculated the actual percentages. But I believe that, okay, here's a problem, by the way. Yes, I believe that a lot of the, let's say, you remember the list of research areas I gave you, with high level and low level and all that stuff? On a high level, from that perspective, like psychology, and you look at like, what are the reasons why I'm doing a certain thing, how I react to stuff, how I observe things, how I recognize objects, all of that. At that high level, I would say the vast majority of myself is very similar to everyone else here. But that's at the high level. If you wanted to make a copy of me at that high level, you couldn't do it. Because the copy, myself is implemented at a lower level. And if you wanted to take what's there and have all the memory, have all the reasons why I would react in a certain way to something that is happening, like the sensory experiences, you would somehow need to tease that out of much lower level stuff. And that is not identical between everyone, because the same kinds of functions can be implemented in so many different ways using such an over-parameterized system as the brain. So that does not, knowing that there's a lot that's similar between us does not make it necessarily easier to copy a certain individual's self into some other hardware architecture. This is, there's lots of room for more talk about that. There's that issue between high level and low level.
Thank you very much, Randal. Let's now move to the end. See that there are not too many of you left. Well, some more now, but for those who are still with us, we want to finish by offering you something like a music performance. And I believe many people will be familiar with the work of the Italian astrophysicist Fiorella Terenzi. She's not only an astrophysicist, she's also a writer and also a musician who somehow managed to synthesize signals from signals from the stars into music from the stars. What I'm going to do now, since Fiorella is with us today, but we do have a PowerPoint presentation with a music clip. Nobody is going to read the presentation. As a matter of fact, several of us offered Fiorella to read the presentation aloud, but she wanted Natasha to read it at the time when Natasha was scheduled to be physically here. Unfortunately, Natasha could not come, and also our internet connection died yesterday in the very middle of Natasha's talk. Fortunately, there is a recording. Anyway, Natasha didn't manage to be here in the flash, she didn't manage to be here in virtual. We are very sorry for that. I wanted to see Natasha again. I think I will invite everyone to give the last applause to Natasha with an order. Natasha is listening to me right now. Very sorry not to have seen you now. I hope to see you next time. I'm going to put on the music clip of Fiorella Terenzi, and then I'm going to go slowly to the slides of her presentation, which are really meant to be read with music as background. If it works.
iTunes just takes a little while to load.
Okay.
fast.
Yeah, but the music is stopped. I think I'll put the music back. Well,
Sandberg? Let's start with this. We should thank Fiorella for this great presentation. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of this year's TransVision. Thank you very much again for coming.
We should thank first of all Julie because he did really a big effort, not just in these 3 days, but in the. Yeah, can you turn off the music, please? Music for the stars. All right, I think we should thank first of all the stars, Giulio, because yes, for his big effort, not just in these 3 days, but in the last 12 months, I think. More or less. Thanks a lot, Giulio.
Thank you very much, the all very few people who are still here. Thanks the other who left already, and hope to see you soon at other events.
Thank you. Thank you.
Song to get to the parts. Location. Yeah, most people speak English.